Was anyone else wondering as she was speaking, when is Brenda Talent running for office? See, I hope, between us, I hope she heard that. All right, folks, we're going to have a panel discussion here in a moment. I want to say, too, as a Christian conservative, I believe in this, I believe in the ideal that the 80-20 rule. We believe on 80% of things, and if there's 20% about which we disagree, then that's fine. But let's accomplish the 80% first. Then we can claw each other's face off over the 20% after we accomplish that 80%. Amen? Yes. I want to welcome our next speaker and our panel discussion leader. Tom Minery is the executive director of Citizen Link, and he has served as a steady voice articulating the conservative Christian viewpoint on family, marriage, and religious civil liberties. He's got his hands full with Obamacare, don't you know? His views and influence have helped to shape public policy at both the national and state levels. Tom oversees the network of 38 state-level family policy councils that have worked to affect the tone of national policy. Please help me welcome Tom Minery.
Well, thank you very much and good morning. Our panel is entitled, Can Conservatives and Libertarians Ever Work Together? That is a big, big topic. The differences between the two have been going on for a long time, and if we do our job right in the next hour, we will solve all of the problems between libertarians and conservatives, and we will unite the right. That's what we're about. And to do so, we have a perfect panel of people who are just eager to get into this. Let me introduce them, bring them out one by one. Our first guest is the chair for the Libertarian Party from 2000 to 2004, re-elected May 2012, member of the Libertarian National Committee for 5 terms, 2 years as the state chair for the Texas Libertarian Party. During his 30 years of Libertarian Party activism, he has worked to ensure that the Libertarian Party stays true to the principles of freedom, small government, non-interventionist foreign policy, and civil liberties. Please welcome Jeff Neal. Our next speaker is an adjunct fellow of the Kirby Center, which is the Washington installation of Hillsdale College, and this gentleman is also one of the senior leaders at the Heritage Foundation, been so for many years. He leads the First Principles Initiative at Heritage. He has taught at Hillsdale, George Mason University, the Catholic University of America, and Claremont McKenna College. He's also a contributor to Fox News. Please welcome Matthew Spaulding. And finally, our third speaker is senior fellow at the Cato Institute, specializing in foreign policy and civil liberties. He worked as special assistant to President Reagan and an editor of the political magazine Inquiry. He writes regularly for leading publications such as Fortune magazine, National Interest, Wall Street Journal, and Washington Times. Please welcome Doug Bundo. Gentlemen, please take your seats and let me introduce what this is really all about. I work at Citizen Link, which is the public policy arm of Focus on the Family. So I am actually a social conservative, not just a conservative. And there is a whole lot about the libertarian platform that we love. The idea of reducing the size of government. Right on, everybody is with that. The idea that government should get out of the way, cut red tape so that entrepreneurs can create real jobs. We are all about that, every one of us in the room this morning. But there's a whole lot about human liberty with an emphasis on the human that makes some of us who are social conservatives a little bit concerned. For example, we see nothing in the libertarian platform about duty to our fellow citizens. There is no transcendent source of values for the cause of human liberty. And we look at that and we think, my goodness, if a free country has got to be led by free people who have within them some kind of moral gyroscope to help them do not just what they want, but to help them to do what they ought. And in Western civilization, that inner moral gyroscope has come from a sense of virtue which emanates from biblical tradition, and we had wished and looked but could not find any sense of that in the Libertarian Party platform. And we think about Thomas Jefferson, who said, "It's the God who gave us life that gave us liberty." We believe that liberty is a gift from God. We don't see that in the Libertarian platform, but we are blessed because we have the single most important guy in libertarian circles to explain, even to me, a social conservative, what I'm missing, why all of that isn't there. So please welcome to the platform the chairman of the Libertarian Party, Jeff Neal.
Thank you very much. It's really great to be here. And I'm glad you started with a softball. But that's okay. The Libertarian Party has been around since 1971.
Yeah.
It was built on a very simple principle. The principle is liberty. At that time, there was an organization called YAF, Young Americans for Freedom. Some of the members of that group thought they were straying too far into the, well, let's call it social issues, and decided that what was needed was an organization that stressed liberty, total liberty, freedom to do as you want, as long as you respect the rights of others. One of our founding fathers of the Libertarian Party, in fact, the most important one, David F. Nolan, who sadly passed away 3 years ago, created this little chart, a little test to differentiate people. And on this, based on how you answered questions of whether you should have the right to decide your life on economic issues or social issues, how you fit into a political spectrum. It's known as either the Nolan chart today or as the world's smallest political quiz. And basically, people in the middle, we call those centrists. Okay, that's where a lot of people end up. People strong on social freedoms but not on economic freedoms, we call those Democrats. People who are strong on economic freedoms but not so much on the socialists, we call those Republicans. People who are strong on both we call libertarians, and people who are strong on neither we call those authoritarians. Now, the reason this was done in the very beginning was very simple. David Nolan wanted to make a differentiation. He said it's really not about left or right. It's about authoritarian versus libertarian. The difference is a government that can tell you how you can conduct your business can tell you how you can pray and what church you can go to. That the authority vested in a government to decide one portion of your life too often gives them the authority, or the mandate as they seem to think, to act in other avenues of the life. So that the only way to have a government that respects the rights of individuals is to have one that oppresses the least. Or as Jefferson said, that government that governs least governs best. He was a religious man. He led by example, however, not by governmental mandate. Well, now what we're seeing in today's world is really simple. Even Matt Drudge came out and said, it's not about Republican or Democrat anymore. It's about libertarian versus authoritarian. Because the power structure in in Washington, it's getting to be very difficult to distinguish between the Republicans and the Democrats. Why would we have a Tea Party or even a Libertarian Party if that wasn't true? So for libertarians, it's not about left or right. It really is about right or wrong. Thank you.
Morning, how are you doing? Thanks, Tom. This is a great panel. Great to be with you. I commend CPAC and especially Al Cardenas. It's important to remember that the conservative movement rests on ideas. And once it forgets that, it will forget and lose its ability to influence politics and inspire the American people. I've been at Heritage Foundation for 20 years. I've actually recently crossed the street, literally. I'm now a Vice President Dean of Hillsdale College, one of the most principled colleges in the United States. I like to ask my students, by a show of hands, what kind of conservative are you? And so I ask them, how many are libertarians? How many are social conservatives? Theocons. Any theocons? How about a neocon? Anybody a paleocon? How about a crunchy con? Crunchy cons are good on everything, but they're soft on the environment. Any crunchy cons? The point is, it's the wrong question. You ask what kind of conservative you are, you immediately divide yourself into a group. And we start squabbling with each other because you think it's an ideology. That's not the right question. The question is, what is it that we wish to conserve? And I would argue to you that that is our country. It's about America and its exceptional principles of liberty and the framework of law that protects the blessings of liberty. But I have to break it to you. The American founders believed in liberty, but they weren't libertarians. Liberty does not necessarily mean anarchy, and it does not mean atomistic individualism. But I must also add at the same time that while they were men of great faith and morals, they were not dogmatists either. We believe in the separation of church and state. It protects religious liberty for everybody and means that churches, as churches, can't tell us what laws to pass. Our founders believed in liberty and the rule of law just as their moral horizon was defined by the classical world and the world of Christian and Judeo-Christian values. Their conservatism, our conservatism, asserts self-evident truths according to the laws of nature and nature's God. It defends fundamental rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that were endowed by our Creator. It recognizes man's self-interest at the same time that it believes in his capacity for virtue. It limits government to the powers delegated to it in the Constitution at the appropriate level of government, at the same time that it makes sure government performs its proper job effectively and energetically. That's not libertarianism or social conservatism, my friends. That's American. That's what our conservatism is about. Can libertarians and social conservatives get along? Of course they can, as long as they remember that the true fusion or ideas is not a policy matter, it's a matter of principle. America's principles remind economic conservatives that morality is essential to limited government, just as it reminds cultural conservatives that unlimited government is a fundamental threat to moral self-government. America's principles were the key to Frank Meyer's fusionism. It was also the key to Ronald Reagan's robust conservatism. It can be that source of vitality again. My friends, conservatives will always disagree and bicker. That's what makes it so interesting to be a conservative. But let's not miss the forest for the trees. We must never let our differences blind us to our common and more noble purpose, which is to conserve the liberating principles of America. Divided, we will lose our country, and we will not withstand the liberal onslaught. United, and only united, we just might save our country and preserve for our children the blessings of liberty. Thank you. God bless you.
It's a great pleasure to be here. It's very good to see in the heartland of America activists concerned about their country, prepared to fight for our liberties. We certainly need it. We live at a time of extraordinary political challenges. Many of those challenges, of course, are issues like health care, the budget, Syria, and many others, as all of you know. Another challenge that we face, of course, is the conservative movement itself. What does it stand for? What holds it together? And the topic that we're talking about now, the kind of libertarian and traditionalist strands of the movement. And while we look at this as being a challenge today, it's important to recognize this is not a new challenge. Go back to the founding of America. We lived at a time where most Americans of the colonies to become a country held a biblical worldview, but they were kind of a motley mix. Some very strong believers, but also thrown in non-believers, deists, dissenters, and others. And they all worked together. And they worked together past those differences to create a new country and a constitution and a republic that they hoped would endure. And they saw the importance both of individual liberty and character in having that republic endure. Go back to the Buckley era. Matt mentioned Frank Meyer, kind of looking at a conservative movement coming out of the New Deal era through the Cold War, a conservative movement that grew to challenge liberalism and indeed overthrew many of the tenets of liberalism. Frank Meyer was very important. He was so-called fusionism. His legacy lives on today. Gene Meyer, his son, heads the Federalist Society. But Frank was very important, saying we must work together, that both character and virtue are important along with liberty. We must bring those together. It was embodied by Ronald Reagan. 1975, in an interview, Ronald Reagan declared, "I believe the very heart and soul of conservatism is libertarianism." Now, he went on to cite differences. He said, I have some problems on some of those issues. But he added, "I stand by my statement that I think that libertarianism and conservatism are traveling the same path." Today, Don Devine, who most of you probably know, a man who served Ronald Reagan along the same administration I worked in, a man who's been active in the American Conservative Union. Don has a new book out, America's Way Back, looking at these issues as well. There's a long concern here of kind of how do we bring the conservative movement together. And I think what both libertarians and conservatives share is a commitment to limited government and individual liberty. And it doesn't really matter, I think, in coming together what our basic theory is. Is it religious or is it secular? Because they really work together in this case. If you're a libertarian and that's your focus, a secular worldview, you believe in responsibility in this life. If you're a Christian or a Jew, you're thinking beyond. You're thinking about the next life. You're thinking about the eternal soul. But there is also going to be responsibility. Both cases see a moral agent who will be held accountable for one's actions. If we look at individuals, recognition of human nature being flawed. Jewish or Christian, you think of original sin. A libertarian probably looks more at Lord Acton's comments. Lord Acton actually was a devout Catholic, but he's famous as a libertarian as well. And he came up with, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And understanding that human beings are tempted by power. So again, we have a sense coming together, human beings are flawed, original sin, and they're tempted by power. That brings them together. There's also a recognition, I believe, that both liberty and virtue are self-reinforcing. It's very hard to have virtue without liberty, without the freedom to make the right choice. But it's also very hard to preserve liberty without virtue. A society in which we don't have character, we don't have virtue, creates extraordinary challenges for government to intervene at every point. I think if you look at both libertarianism and conservatism on most issues, we come together. The government should be small, it should be limited, it should be constrained. Individual rights should be constitutionally protected. Broadly speaking, it's what Grover Norquist talked about with the leave us alone, stay away. Let us live our lives. Let us bring up our families. Let us provide for our needs. Let's work in our communities. Leave us alone. The battle for these goals is strengthened if we work together. Think of Obamacare. Expensive, inefficient, destroys individual choice, takes away our opportunity to decide for ourselves the most fundamental decisions on health care. Also destructive of individual conscience and religion, mandating that one must, whatever one's faith perspective, cover procedures one finds sinful. Bring those arguments together, much more powerful. Arguments that all libertarians and conservatives can agree upon. Now, this is not to ignore significant differences that will come between us. This is inevitable. But we have far more in common because we face a common threat, an overarching abusive state. We must work together and promote both virtue and liberty. Thank you.
All right. You have heard our panelists. Now let me tell you why each of these gentlemen is up here, because they're up here for a reason. Jeff, of course, is the spokesman and the leader of the Libertarian Party. Matt Spalding has written a very thoughtful book on the founding, the principles of the constitutions, the importance of virtue in liberty, and the importance of transcendent values that guided the founders as I put this grand experiment together. Doug Mondo, like Jeff, is a libertarian. Cato Institute is decidedly libertarian. But Doug has written very thoughtfully about the importance of biblical principle within the context of freedom and the context of politics. So these gentlemen have thought about these issues many, many years. Let me start by asking a question of Matt. Matt, you said in your opening remarks that it is essential for there to be morality within political principle. Now, when you say to a social conservative like me, from the political arm of Focus on the Family, morality, I'm thinking of moral truths such as the importance of marriage, the dignity of unborn life, the right to life for all people. You get into some messy issues. Matt, convince Jeff that those messy issues ought to be in the libertarian platform.
Well, I think to go to your first point, and Doug alludes to this as well, I mean, these two sides of the movement absolutely need each other, not just for practical purposes, not merely to build a coalition, but for intellectual reasons. The reason we believe in liberty is because we believe all men are created equal, not just because of the Creator, but the philosophical notion that they are equal is a moral argument. None is fit to rule, none is fit to be enslaved. That's a moral argument. Right there, we're saying there's a moral argument that has political implications. This radical separation of these ideas doesn't make sense. The question is, how do you filter them? We need virtue, we need the argument of character to be good citizens. That's a practical argument. The hard thing to deal with is what happens when you come up to these issues that cut directly to what I would say is a moral principle. Think of abortion or marriage or cloning, or how do we deal with replicating people's DNA? There's all sorts of philosophical questions. The modern state, the massive modern state, is forcing us to look at these in a new way we've never looked at before. I would give you, I'll just make 2 points. One is, we can't ignore the fact that there are principles and questions before us as a people, and we are citizens in a republic that have a responsibility to voice our opinions as we best understand those things. Right? We can't ignore that, and the same principles that got us liberty in the first place, that we are equal in our humanity, touches upon the question about whether those things are part of humanity. So we can't ignore them. How we do it is a question of what's the proper method of consent and constitutional government, and how we go through that process of legislating and preventing judges from forcing these things upon us. That's another question. These things will be messy. They'll always be. There's not a final answer. That's what freedom is about. But the idea of somehow throwing them out, I think, is not consistent with our own principles, but more importantly, they're not consistent with our humanity, which demands that we do address these questions, because we are a free people who are drawn to these higher things.
Has he convinced you?
Well, I was convinced before.
Oh,
Look, the problem is really simple. Libertarianism is taken by many people as a philosophy. It's not a political means. It's a philosophical approach to living life and governing. For example, if you want to be a member of the Libertarian Party, you have to sign a pledge that says, I hereby certify that I do not advocate the initiation of force for political or social gain. You can't be a member if you don't agree to that. Now, let me simplify that. What we really say is that libertarians are opposed to the initiation of force or fraud. Let me translate that into Christian. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It is a moral statement. It is the essence of coexistence in any civilized culture, in my opinion. And you will find that same basic concept in many, many different religions. Maybe not as eloquent as it is in our King James translation. You know, I mean, hey, down south, what goes around comes around. Same kind of concept. Our problem as libertarians is we go, oh, hey, we never put that on our platform. It is in our bylaws. It's in our very being. It's so, and I just realized sitting in front of all of you here, if you look at our platform, you go, well, you guys have no moral foundation. Yes, we do. A very strong one, respect of other people. that we will not force other people to do what they don't want to do through action or fraud. And we don't believe the government has the authority to do that either. And so that really is what we're about. So I argue in return that we are moral, we're just really bad at advertising that we're moral.
That's encouraging. Thank you very much.
But you made a very important distinction there, which I will grant and agree with, which is that as long as we understand libertarianism as a way of governing, which is a practical argument, and not as a philosophy, the problems don't present themselves in the same way. The problem is that we too often assume that libertarianism, or other isms for that matter, is an ideology, right? Conservatives are against ideologies, and that somehow it carries through everything, and thus we must follow its logic to an extreme. And it does become this atomistic and problematic individualism that is almost anarchical. I'm not saying you advocate that, but that distinction you made is crucially important. But it does raise the question then, okay, from the practical arguments about how we're going to govern ourselves, which I agree is the question, you still have to have philosophical roots to that so that you have a consistent policy and carry that through. And there we agree that since we can't answer the highest questions, theological and philosophical, we have a constitution based on consent, and we have self-government, and we also have the notion that the majority, or supermajorities in the sense of constitutionalists, but a majority can make basic decisions about how things are to be organized, and that especially at lower levels of government, the federal government especially less so, the state governments more so, and local government, state and locals had a police power. They have more authority to design how we live our lives together. It's called federalism, right? That's a good way of governing. But it does suggest that there are sometimes we do make rules, basic rules, and that we agree to those, and that's part of being in a civilized society and being a citizen. So I think the distinction you made was important, but we as a movement need to keep that in mind. Keep that in mind, because the more we argue for it, if we assume this is a philosophy that goes everywhere, that's where things get into trouble, and it makes it impossible for us to agree when there's 80% agreement, because the mind always wants to go to those extremes. And that's where we get off board, I think.
Well, thanks. You mentioned political philosophy. Let's get right to the root of political philosophy and go to Doug. Doug, you said something in your opening remarks that you have written very thoughtfully about in your book a few years ago. You said that virtue requires liberty, and also that liberty requires virtue. Which comes first?
I think they're both together. I think it's very hard to separate them. And it's hard to imagine a virtuous society where we do not have the freedom to sin. I mean, we have to have moral education. We have to be informed about choices to make. I mean, the basis of Christian freedom is to do the right thing. We need to have liberty to be able to do that. I don't see any virtue in a coerced act. So if one wants a virtuous society, one has to have that opportunity and that liberty. On the other hand, it's very hard to see how you can maintain a free society if people are not virtuous. I mean, much of what we do, the reason we can exist without government is self-governance. We live in families and communities and churches. We take care of needs. Most people don't steal. We work with one another. We have an extraordinary willingness, go back to de Tocqueville, to take care of those who are in need. All of this comes out of character. That kind of character and virtuous behavior allows us to have a very limited government. Instead of a state that has to control everything, the old Soviet totalitarianism, everything must be regulated. So I think it's very hard to pull those apart. And I think the founders really understood that. That the founders, the famous exchange with Benjamin Franklin. The woman asked him, what kind of a government have you created? He said, a republic if you can keep it. That understanding that, we've created institutions that are generally free. We've created separation of powers, checks and balances, all this stuff. But that character, the people, is also very important. And I think we make a mistake if we try to pull the two apart. And if you skimp on one or the other, I think you unbalance the system. I think that's a problem. I think the real issue in terms of libertarianism, I think the point that is very important is libertarianism is a political philosophy. It's not a worldview. It's not libertinism. And unfortunately, some libertarians manage to help confuse that, I think, by their own behavior. But it's very different I mean, the point is libertarians say, not all sin should be against the law. I mean, that's kind of the sense that when do you rely on the state? What kind of activities? And I would argue it's fundamentally a moral philosophy. That is, all law is based on some moral conception. And the laws that I think of, it's interpersonal morality. You can't kill. You can't commit fraud. Where I think libertarians are very skeptical is when you start talking more about intrapersonal morality, fixing your soul, making you a better citizen. And there I start thinking about, oh boy, Barack Obama's going to fix me. Isn't that really wonderful? Bill Clinton, he's going to go lead the moral revival. I mean, that's where libertarians start saying, whoa, maybe, we believe in these moral principles. We want people to be virtuous, but maybe that's not where we want to put responsibility for that kind of uplifting people, that moral education and teaching.
Very good. You mentioned the word libertinism. Jeff, if I might, let me read from the Libertarian Party platform and make a comment on it and get your response to it. Part of the Libertarian platform says this: government does not have the authority to define, license, or restrict personal relationships. Consenting adults should be free to choose their own sexual practices and personal relationships. Now, somebody like me reads that, and I'm thinking, that sounds like a lot of casual sex. And when I think of that, I think there are going to be a lot of children produced casually. And casual and children do not go together. It is hard work. It takes a long time to raise children properly. If we're talking about casual sex and casual offspring, it seems to me that's a recipe for bigger government, because when you think about fatherless boys roaming around, you're going to be having to expand the police departments. You're going to have to get more judges, more courts, more social service workers, and more foster care homes. If you want to reduce government, help us strengthen the family rather than talk about libertine principles in the platform. Now, have I offended you?
Well, no, because I didn't write the platform. I only represent it.
That's close enough. That's close enough. Go ahead and represent it.
And to be honest with you, I'm such a politician that I just don't care about the platform, because I know if I'm a candidate, it doesn't mean squat. Because after all,
problem with platforms.
Should we point out all the Republican and Democratic candidates that don't even pay lip service to their party's platforms? To a certain degree, a platform is a useless document. But now the next thing I'd say is that as chair of the Libertarian Party, and whether I was chair or not, I'd say the same thing. I think it's everybody's responsibility to live a virtuous life. And the reason I do is because I believe that good people do good things and live good lives. I wasn't born in this country. I chose to become an American at the age of 17. My parents moved here from England, where I was born. And at that age, I decided I was American. So I'm American by choice, and I hope you guys will think that's strong enough. But I know that I have some small amount of influence from my upbringing. And I come from Bristol, England, which is the site of the First Methodist Church. And Methodism is very much about the concept that Christians live good lives. They don't just say good things. And I'm very much a believer in that concept, that libertarianism is the same thing. I don't care what you say. How do you live? Virtue is a very important thing. To me, family is extremely important. I will go on record right now and tell you all that I have been married for 38 years to the same person who is a woman, never had a sex change operation. I do have a daughter. She is also married. She said, I don't want to be married more than once. This is the man I want to stay married with for the rest of my life. We care for my wife's elderly mother in our home. She's not in a care facility because we can't be bothered. I don't know, isn't that what family values are supposed to be? Isn't that kind of encapsulate a lot of them? And what I'm saying is not because I don't want applause for that, because I think most of you in this room would be the same way. You do the same thing. You do the right thing. You live the right way. Is it because the government tells you so? Do you do it out of fear of God? Or do you, even if religion is your motivation, do you do it because God said this is the right way to live and I want all of my children to live the right way? And I think that's a libertarian concept. You'd have to eavesdrop on some of our meetings, except you can't eavesdrop. You can just walk right in because they're all public. We don't have private meetings. We don't have privacy if you're the chair. I have people thinking anytime they talk to me, they can quote me in public, even if they ask a personal question of like what sports team I want. We carry our opinions of the burdens of leadership so far, and what we have instead in Washington is a bunch of self-interested, fill in the gap, who vote their own damn interests, who think they're exempt from the law. They've created a new aristocracy, and I'm from a country with an aristocracy. I was born in England. Let me tell you, it sucks. We don't need it. We overthrow it once. They need to be gone. They need to hold themselves to a higher standard than we do.
All right. Well said.
Is that moral enough for you?
That's pretty good. Start writing. We want to see it in the party platform. Matt, you have written something in your excellent book, We Still Hold These Truths. You wrote this: human nature provides common moral precepts about virtue and happiness which can be understood and upon which everyone could agree. My question is, what happens when everyone no longer agrees? Can we hold this grand experiment in government together much longer with everyone going his own way?
I think the answer is patently no. And now, setting aside the role of government in that question, just to make a general point, is that without certain common precepts, which doesn't mean we all belong to the same religion or believe everything in total, but without certain common things that we believe in, which means we would be willing to uphold as a people and fight for, we can't have a common project, which means we can't have a country. It's never been the case that this is a country of individuals that have nothing in common. That never works. This is an experiment. America is an experiment. Can we combine these things? In a certain sense, what we're talking about here is the essence of the American experiment. Can we have self-government and constitutionalism, which means there are certain basic things we are going to agree to. At the same time, can we maximize the amount of freedom to believe and pursue other things as well? Now, I think that requires two things. One is it does require a certain culture, a moral culture, a culture that forms good citizens, good moral citizens. I think on that we probably all agree. But it also requires a type of government that is set up to be a framework so we get as free as possible, but it does recognize the need to encourage certain things. And here I come back to the points we've kind of been going around with, right? So Doug makes a point, which I agree with him, that most sins should not be illegal. I agree with that, but it begs the question, right? And I agree with the idea that government should be involved in most of these things. And government today is so big and so bureaucratic, it's virtually a tyranny. I only add virtually in quotation marks, right? It's doing everything. So I know this is a bad situation. But just think generally. The job of government is to create a framework for self-government by which we can govern ourselves. It needs to protect contracts and do all sorts of things like that. But it also cannot be oblivious of the need to encourage certain institutions which shape our character. Education, not doing it very well today, but in general, education is one of those. How about religious institutions? Religious institutions can't shape government, but our Constitution guarantees that they will have the freedom of exercise, so they can do what they believe in. And we encourage that. We give them tax exemption. Why? Because those institutions are the ones that not government, but they shape our character. And that is such a public good that we will encourage it. And we have never severed that relationship. We want to encourage civil society. We want to strengthen it. We want to create the conditions so it will flourish. Is that the job of government? Well, when you have a massive welfare state and they start mucking around it, they're going to make a mess of it. I completely agree with that. But having said that, a limited government, the limited government of the founders, does still do that at the appropriate level, because it recognizes that we're not a bunch of automatons. There are certain institutions, the family, crucially, the institutions of civil society, the marketplace. These are institutions that must be encouraged and that government cannot be oblivious of. And how you do that in a way that is consistent with that order that we need to have a flourishing self-government and the maximization of liberty is always a balance, and we'll always argue, but it's a balance, which is why all the comments we hear from my libertarian friends go up to that point, but they never cross it. They recognize that it's not an extreme, it's not an ideological position, which is to say it's not a pure position. There's always room for those other things. That's where we want to get back to. That's where we have to get back to if this regime is going to continue to exist. And I think coming up with a language to do that and drives in the same direction, and given where we're at today, it's not that hard, to be perfectly honest. That's where we need to go. But yes, we need to keep in mind that at the end of the day, if we reduce the size of government and make it smaller and balance its budget and drive back to the limits, but the culture in the meantime has been destroyed by the modern welfare state, and it's been completely and utterly gutted of its ability to shape our characters, it's still a question whether this experiment will continue.
Thank you. Very, very thoughtful. I appreciate that very much. Doug, in your book, you have quoted several times from Richard John Neuhaus, someone who know him love and whom we miss. And you said, you quoted him by saying that the naked public square, the title of his book, The Naked Public Square, is a dangerous place. And his point is that without a sense of morality that binds us all together, that gives us a sense of doing what we ought, not just what we want, without that sense of morality, a naked public square is a dangerous place. Would you expand on that and explain whether that's still true, whether it's more true, and what the antidote to that is?
Well, I think there are two issues, one of which is that the strongest protection for individual liberty comes out of a transcendent worldview. I mean, a belief that you're created by God, that you have eternal value, you're more important than any empire, strikes me as being the firmest foundation for individual liberty. I mean, the notion that there's no political institution that can take that away because God has created you and endowed you with moral worth. So I think that itself, now that's something that just can't be made up. I mean, that's something that people have to believe. But I do think that that is the foundation, the strongest foundation for any society of liberty. So I think a public square that doesn't have that ethos around itself has a foundation that can crumble. And the second is the notion of what worries me about the naked public square. I mean, Richard John Neuhaus, of course, wrote on this eloquently, is that if someone will rule, I mean, it's when I lecture to students, I always tell them, doesn't matter where you're at, you better be involved because somebody in Washington will make decisions. I mean, if the public square is kind of naked in terms of faith and transcendent worldviews, there will be other worldviews. I mean, it's not as if suddenly worldviews disappear. It's simply this worldview won't be there and all the others will be there. So that's a very dangerous place as well. That believers cannot expect to rule, they cannot expect to dominate, but certainly their beliefs need to be part of that discussion, part of that formation, part of the understanding of what American politics is about and what policy should be about. So if we have a system that tries to push out simply that one, all of the others will come to dominate, and that strikes me as being a very dangerous place. So I think it's the two notions, one of which is the strongest foundation is going to be a transcendent, and we can argue, it doesn't a particular theology, that doesn't mean just Christian or Jewish or something else, but the notion that we're a created order and that we have eternal worth, I think is extraordinarily important. And the second is if that conception gets forced out, others will dominate, and that's very dangerous.
Thank you very much. By the way, you gentlemen have generated a lot of questions from this audience. We have probably 50, 75 questions. I've been furiously trying to sort through them, trying to read some handwriting, and keep one ear on the dialogue. Let's get to them, and in no particular order and response. What do you consider our one founding document? Anybody want to take that?
Well, I think that the answer has to be two. They're two sides of the same coin, the Declaration and the Constitution. Everything about the Declaration is subsumed by every other document before it. Everything about the Declaration determines and necessitates the Constitution to come after it. But I put them together, and we must always put them together. We have too often conservatives we talk about the Constitution in a legalistic way. And I'm all for its limits, and that's crucially important. But the moral argument that makes the Constitution possible, right? You can't limit government unless you previously establish the moral argument, which I would argue is dependent upon a transcendent value. You can't limit government to its powers unless you first argue that government by its nature only has power because we, the people who are the humanity, each in our individual natures, have rights, right? And that's what the Declaration does for you. So you need both of those documents, I think, or else you do not have the argument that it's America.
I think that's right. I think the Declaration explains what they wanted to do and why they wanted to do it, and the Constitution is the outgrowth of that. That's the practical implementation of the worldview that was presented in the Declaration.
Now, the challenge that presents for the libertarian argument in the Declaration is, recall, the Declaration says we hold these truths to be self-evident. And it says there's something, the laws of nature and nature's God. Now, set aside for a moment a particular religious argument. Jefferson, for one, didn't mean it in a particular religious way, in a dominational way. But he did mean that in the nature of things, there are certain things we can know. And that precept is the beginning of constitutionalism. That's what makes America exceptional. And that's why, no matter how much the Supreme Court tries or how much other people try, you cannot rid America of its grounding in the recognition that there is something beyond us and higher, and that recognition is absolutely necessary for freedom.
See, that's good stuff, Jeff. Why don't you put some of that stuff in your party platform? We love it.
Well, I mean, it's a very good point. I mean, let's face it. If we were better at marketing, well, we'd probably be running a show. We are the Libertarians, and you can hear, this is the kind of discussions that go on all the time within the Libertarian circles. This is great for people who are literary minded. It's not in our platform that we hold this as a founding document, but we do. I mean, you'd have to pay me a pretty high commission rate to find enough people to make it worth my while to go look out for people who don't think the foundations of this country and even libertarianism is the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, but here's where we're missing the boat. I mean, you said this is a great argument for a literary group. I disagree with that. What we're missing is the fact that America is a debate about what America means. Barack Obama understands that, which is why he wants to wrap himself in the precepts of the Constitution and the Declaration. He's trying to steal our arguments in the same way that Franklin Roosevelt did. We have to claim that moral ground, and speaking in terms of the Declaration and the Constitution is what the American people still understand, because they believe this is a great nation. And it's no coincidence that the Tea Party, when it goes out there, what do they have in their pockets? The Declaration and the Constitution.
Sure.
That's the language of America. And if you don't have that, and if that thing is not the grounding of your political principles, whether you're a libertarian, Republican, or whatever party you want to be, if that thing is not the ground, you are not participating in the American conversation.
Well, what I say to that, though, is again, I think that what we're hitting in that it's so. I'm thankful for all of you because I'm going to take this feedback. It's so obvious to libertarians that these are our founding documents that we don't bother to tell people and put them up on our banners and flags and things like that, but they are. There's no question about it. Libertarians are strict constitutionalists. Do we think it's a perfect document? No, we don't. But what's amazing is just how good it was. They got it real close. All right.
It is.
And the government has really, but
Easy.
on the whole moral issue for me, my perspective is even more than just a libertarian. There's times where I feel like I look at government and go, this is not a group of people who are working together to achieve any other objective that they seem to say they're really trying to achieve. it really appears to me that what the objective is, soaking the American people, keeping them as confused as possible about what's really going on, hiding what they're really up to, delivering nothing of real value except basically, well, bluntly, folks, it's a cancer. And they're slowly, well, not so slowly anymore, consuming the host that's keeping it alive. It is a disorganized mass, not a rational intent. And I am emotional, of course, but I'm also rational. I like things to make sense. And I know that all great truths are simple. For every time somebody says, oh, it's not that simple, it's really very complicated. It is that simple, folks. It's about my rights. It's about your rights. It's not that the government has more or special. There are no group rights. There are no gay rights. There are no women's rights. There are no African American rights. There's human rights. We all have the same rights.
In the closing line of the Declaration of Independence, though, Jeff, it says in these words, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. There was a sense that these guys were in this together for a huge purpose. It's that individualism, that sense of every man for himself that I get when I read your party platform. That just leaves me a little bit questioning where it's all coming from.
Well, what we believe is in voluntary association and disassociation. And when people, I know because of my life and how things go, that when you take government influence and government oppression and action out and you allow good people to interact, that they do wonderful things. I have a faith in the human spirit and the human nature, when not perverted by outside sources, to act very well together. I live in a funny little place that somehow ended up being outside of anybody's authority. About 500 or 600 people live there. We don't get very much in the way of government services. The lots are fairly large. It's semi-rural, but now it's getting taken over. But what we have is this group of people without a formal homeowners association with no rules. But we have exchanges, we have email lists, we have cooperative, and you would say, oh my God, you guys are like a community from the 1850s or the 1830s, where there is a natural order there. There is people being good to each other, coming together for the common good of the neighborhood, helping each other out when they're needed all day long. And I believe, and this is why I'm a libertarian, that when you take out all these government requirements that you must act a certain way, you must behave in a certain manner, or you have to get a permit from the city of LA to give a sandwich to a hungry person, that did happen to me. That all we're doing is the government is stripping us of our bare essence of what we are as good human beings. What we need is the freedom to act like good people. And we all have it within us. But now when the government comes along and says, well, you can't give a sandwich to a homeless person because you'll be liable for a suit because that person might get sick and blah, blah, blah. That's the government. That's not people. It's getting in the way of our human nature. And so I really believe that dismantling from the top down as much as we can, keep what we need. We need justice. We need a judicial system. We need a national defense. We could argue about how big it should be and what its role it should be in public policy, but we do need one.
Hey, let me break in there and turn to that question of national defense. American exceptionalism, the idea that we have some basic self-evident truths that we have successfully or unsuccessfully managed to put into our government. How does that guide our responsibility overseas? How does the sense of America as the world's policeman play into our responsibility as a result of our exceptional position in the world? How does that work together? Doug, I wonder if you might take a crack at that and do so in brief fashion.
All right.
Well, I think there's an important difference between what Americans do and what the American government does. And I'm always skeptical when conservatives who hate social engineering at home suddenly tell me they can fix foreign nations. I mean, we have 12 years in Afghanistan trying to do something. I'm not sure what it is. I've been there twice. I've yet to find an Afghan who thinks his government is anything but a bunch of thieves. So I think both humility and prudence play a role in this. I think America's role in the world has been exceptional. But the primary responsibility of the U.S. government is to its own citizens. It's to protect our lives, our constitutional system, our people, our liberties. It's not to remake the globe. And that doesn't mean there aren't enemies out there. If somebody reaches a hand out, I want them to draw back a bloody stump. But we want to be very careful. To me, the prudence and humility are very important here. That I think for conservatives, those are fundamental governance at home, it's fundamental governance abroad. We should be proud of what America is. And as Americans, we should be involved all over the world. Humanitarianism, culture. I mean, there's so much we have done that's been wonderful. Again, that impulse to help others, I think, is extraordinary. And the most powerful kind of sale of America is Americans. Going around the world, making friends, helping people, educating. So to me, that's what the government has a very critical role, but it shouldn't do everything. We need to recognize outside of government is where we do much of the most important stuff.
Right. I completely agree, but where the government should do things, it should do them very strenuously.
And well, absolutely. If you're going to get involved, don't muck around.
Right.
Don't get our people killed doing stupid things and doing it badly.
I think there's broad agreement, right? And the key term there is prudence. But of course, prudence requires an understanding of principle, so we can know when it's in our best national interest to do something, and when we should act. And when we should act decisively. And again, the way to think about foreign policy is not to think about it in terms of isms, whether it's non-interventionism or isolations or something like this. We should think about what are America's interests, what are our principles, who threatens us, and how we should act in the world. So I agree with you.
Yeah, I mean, I have a problem with our foreign policy. The only way I can encapsulate what the American government's current foreign policy is it depends.
Who knows?
It depends. And I don't know. I can't predict how the government's going to react in another country with the same circumstance. I mean, my mother talked with me recently. She said, "Is it really matter how people die? Would it be okay if 1,500 people were beaten to death with 2x4s?"
Depends on whether they're Americans or not.
Well, it does. But in Syria, and of course, then with millions dead in the Congo, that's kind of okay because it wasn't chemical. I have a hard time criticizing our foreign policy because I can't find a policy.
I think most Americans would agree with you.
Right.
And I would say regarding chemical warfare, there are a lot of people who are dying every day in this country as a result of chemically induced abortions, and the president has not said anything about that, and that concerns us as well. All right, we're just about out of time. Can't resist a political question. If Rand Paul becomes a 2016 Republican Party nominee, will the Libertarian Party endorse him?
Well, we'd have to change our bylaws to do that.
All right.
Okay, our bylaws, in other words, our delegates are going to make that choice. I can't say they would, but let's face it. We love Ron Paul because of what he's done to bring the word liberty and libertarian into the forefront. And at the same time, we really hate the guy because, well, he's stolen the thunder from the Libertarian Party because he's running as a Republican. We think that gives too much validation to the Republican Party that is not deserved because it really is Ron Paul who's deserving of it, not necessarily just the Republican Party. And we will have members who will support Ron Paul, and we'll have members who will not if he is the nominee. That's just the way it's going to be.
All right.
Can I say something on that real quick? I mean, look, if Rand Paul becomes the nominee, he will become the nominee because he realizes in a two-party system, you have to have a majority to win. And in order to win, he's going to have to figure out how to build a consensus with the American people that creates that majority. And the majority out there is going to demand a language and an enunciation of principles about America that reach out in a way that brings that consensus together. He will not win if he runs as a strict libertarian. He will not win the same way another candidate will not win if they run merely as a social conservative. He will win if he runs as someone who wants to conserve America, and he makes that argument. And if he continues moving that way, he's probably going to do a damn good
I
job.
think he's trying to do that.
All right, you see how much time we have left, which is probably nothing. Is anybody dying to say one last thing here?
We need to work together. Look, we face an extraordinary threat out there. It threatens liberty, it threatens virtue. We look at the government today. We must work together. The enemy that we face is far greater than any differences among us.
All right, well said.
Completely agree. I think in terms of studying American history,